Hi everybody, it's Craig here with you for the week 2 feedback video of maintaining a mindful life. Really hope you are maintaining a mindful life. Richard?
Yeah, well, I'm doing my best, Craig. It's certainly an important time, isn't it, to
Yeah.
be practicing mindfulness.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, this course is so powerful because it goes into these topics and these areas that people maybe often don't think of when they think about mindfulness practice, like relationships, how we show up with ourselves and with others. And these are, of course, very important things to do during challenging circumstances.
Yeah. And please, I mean, as we've said before, that if you are new to mindfulness, then take it gently, take it slowly, practice the things you're comfortable to practice, because it's not an easy place to start. This is a course, it's really designed for people who've had a bit more experience with it. I think the topic of empathy and compassion and the difference between those two things has really created a lot of interest this week, and how it's one thing to actually get a sense of how somebody's feeling when the person's feeling distressed, and there's a kind of empathy, but to fall into the kind of sense of feeling distressed by somebody else's distress, to get caught up in that distress. And very often we activate the stress response, which is very different to when we're feeling compassion, where there's actually areas, we experience the positive emotions associated with that. And of course, many learners have been noticing that if we do get caught up in distress, of others' distress, it very quickly leads to this kind of empathy fatigue. And in times when there's so much distress being expressed by so many people, I think in this COVID situation, it's a pretty important topic that we cultivate compassion, but we learn not to get caught in the distress that others are experiencing. And of course, with that compassion comes a desire, if it's possible, to help where help is possible. So it's been quite an interesting and I think really important topic this week. And there was a question about, if we are compassionate, does it reduce the suffering of others? And of course, we would all know from experience, apart from the research, that when we are distressed and there is somebody who's calm but compassionate and warm-hearted with us, it has a totally different effect than if we're with somebody who's very stressed and trying to impose some kind of hard and fast remedy on us. And so stress is contagious, and that's one of the interesting things. And but so can compassion be contagious?
Got to be careful with all this talk of contagion these days, Craig. I think we might find a new metaphor there.
I was choosing my word.
This is the good virus. This is compassion going viral. Craig, some of our learners ask some really interesting questions around putting other people's needs before their own. And is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How do we know the difference? And for me, it's a very interesting question. A lot of the time, I think when we are putting other people's needs ahead of our own, it can be a bit of a habit. I see this a lot in my clients, and quite often people are, very selflessly putting their kids or their partner or their friends ahead of themselves. And it's not that that's a bad thing. I mean, it's a very pro-social, perhaps compassionate thing to do. But if you look closely, sometimes there are certain symptoms like a feeling of burnout or resentment. And these are signs that perhaps things are a little bit out of balance. And it's interesting, most people have heard of the fight and flight response. And of course, we talk about that at length in both of our courses here, particularly Mindfulness for Wellbeing and Peak Performance. And some people have heard of the freeze response. So you've got fight, flight, freeze. But there's actually a fourth response that researchers have been talking about, which is the Fawn response, fawning. So under threat, some people make themselves useful and they be kind and they be generous, perhaps as a way of not being rejected, or perhaps as a way of feeling like they have a sense of belonging. And when we're in the Fawn response, I think that's when we do put our own needs separate, second, and we can get into those areas where perhaps we do go a little bit sort of, too far, or maybe neglect ourselves in the process. So it's really important, the motivation behind that. It's one thing to be compassionate. It's another thing to be kind of fawning and doing that in a reactive way. And in my experience, the main sort of sign that we're doing the fawning is that we tend to feel a bit resentful or depleted or overwhelmed.
Yes, and I think that looking at the motivation behind the helping response is interesting, and it's not for somebody else to say, but for us to be aware and in the moment ourselves to notice what's driving it. Are we activating stress response, having to fix everybody and everything else? Are we actually doing things outwardly that are helping but inwardly there's a kind of resentment and internal commentary about that. So we have to really investigate that for ourselves and be clear about our own motivation. And if it comes from the right place, then, as it were, then it'll be experienced very differently than if it's coming from stress or obligation or something else. And a lot of interesting discussion and people finding very helpful things like the kindness meditation and compassion meditations this week, Richard.
Yeah, Craig, very helpful, and for some people very triggering as well. It can bring up quite a lot. So, of course, loving kindness or kindness meditation, that's where we take the acceptance and non-judgment part of mindfulness and really turn up the volume on that so that we deliberately cultivate a sense of kindness for ourselves and for others. And that can be a very profoundly, transformative practice as we learn to, genuinely, wish for our own well-being, or perhaps the well-being of loved ones. And then we bump into that difficult territory where we're trying to wish well-being for somebody who's maybe hurt us, or for a politician on the world stage, someone, who it would be very easy to kind of dislike, to then start sort of perhaps seeing them as a human being and then realising that, like us, they also want happiness. And then, of course, they want to avoid suffering as well. That's where when kindness, when loving kindness touches suffering or distress, that's when it becomes compassion. And so these practices can be profoundly positive, as we practice them on ourselves, improving our own well-being, but also, of course, wishing it for others, and perhaps getting out of those usual reactive patterns of watching the news and thinking all these angry thoughts about the politicians and how they should be doing a better job, and we would be if we were just in that role, and perhaps see that maybe they're doing the best that they can and they're caught in a system, and that they're no one really knows what the answer is with COVID, perhaps.
Yes. And I think that's one of the things that happens when we become more mindful ourselves, is we actually see we have our own difficult moments. We see a little bit more of what motivates our own behaviour and so on. And you kind of get a sense of more understanding for others and a little bit more, perhaps forgiveness is, I think, a natural sign of being more mindful.
Yeah, and the common humanity, I would add to that, Craig, just the sense that we're all in this together. We're all more similar than we are different, really.
Yeah. And
mindfulness shows us that.
And if we can start to view our own responses with a little bit more awareness and compassion, then we kind of, I think it makes it easier to start to cultivate that for others as well.
Yes.
Because we see what's on the surface, somebody being difficult, we don't see what's going on under the surface, which is they're wrestling with their own fears and anxieties and everything else that might be going on. And in relationships, how can a relationship work properly if the other person's not mindful, or if the other person's perhaps a bit more negative? And you see, I suspect it's not about trying to fix somebody else and what can I do to change them to be the way that I think that, ought to be, and so on. All we can do is bring mindfulness to our own interactions, to our own situation. We're not, in a sense, working on somebody else. So it's, responsibility is an interesting word. It means the ability to respond, but we only have the ability to respond to our own stuff. We don't have the ability to respond for somebody else. And so, how can we develop a way of being mindful in the presence of somebody who's not mindful? How can we remain open? How can we remain considerate? How can we give that person a compassionate ear, or somebody's negativity? How do we not get caught up in their negativity? So it's really us doing the work for ourselves rather than, how can I change somebody else? And I think at the end of the day, that brings the work back home to our own responsibility and frees us of the burden of trying to change and get everybody else the way that we think they should be.
Yeah. But part of that radical self-responsibility, Craig, is also having a very clear sense of our own needs and our boundaries, and really honouring and respecting them. Mindfulness certainly doesn't mean to not have boundaries or not have needs, or to allow, as we've said many times in our feedback videos for this course, to allow bad behaviour or negative behaviour that harms us and, harms the person who's doing it. Sometimes mindfulness really is about owning, okay, why do I feel uncomfortable in this situation? What are my boundaries that are being crossed? What are my needs that aren't being met? And then from a grounded, present place, being able to perhaps, reassert those boundaries or express those needs.
Yes. And at the end of the day, I mean, if we do find, we are aware that a relationship is not healthy or not bringing out in us the things that we want to bring out in our life, then we have to make a choice sometimes. And we don't always get to avoid people would like to avoid, but we do have a choice very often about which relationships do we want to cultivate in our lives or spend more time on, and which ones not. And that really requires awareness and letting go as well sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so that's perhaps all for this week. Next week, we're going to be exploring a few other things as well: self-compassion, emotional health, working mindfully with pain and discomfort. So, and just a little reminder too, we really welcome such fantastic discussion on the forums, but not to disclose very personal information, of course, because it is a public forum. So please just take care with that and skip anything that doesn't feel right for you. And please do follow our moderators who are doing a fantastic job. Of supporting your learning. So Sherelle and Jen. So we'll look forward to being with you next week. And between now and then, have a mindful week.
See you next week.